they technically are part of the team. They're external people that are part of the project team. But if, for example, I work in the training department, the training team, but I want to share something in there with an external party, I wouldn't add them to, even if I want to share the whole site with them, I wouldn't add them to the group, because that group represents the training team. That external person is not part of the training team. They're a customer. I want to just have them accessing certain sites, whatever, or certain content. So we can share site only as opposed to adding them to the group, or of course we can just share individual content. Now, as we said, the problem, or not the problem, the risk is that if people, in order to share one file externally, external sharing has to be turned on for the whole site. Therefore, because of the nature of maybe some sensitive information, coupled with not trusting people to share things appropriately because of a lack of knowledge, then maybe I just create a second site for that. So here is where we put external stuff that you want to share externally. Here is where we keep the stuff that needs to be a bit more secure because there's sensitive information. In the likes of the HR site, I certainly wouldn't. There might be information I need to share with auditors or with some other kind of external party that exists in the HR site. I wouldn't share it from the HR site. HR is the type of site that you definitely want to keep with external sharing disabled. So what you could do in that instance is you've got your general HR site, which is for internal collaboration. Then maybe you've got a second HR site, which is purely for sharing HR content externally. So so yeah, I'll probably create a second site in that case. Otherwise, there's no reason why we can't use just a folder inside a SharePoint site, inside a library, or a separate library inside that site for external sharing. So private channel in Teams essentially does that, which creates a separate site collection with unique permissions. It does, yeah. I mean, it's, as a general rule, I don't. I think that private channels should be quite a rarity because, as a general rule, a site is there to store information on a subject or a topic, and in the vast majority of situations, that content needs the same permissions as the rest of the content in that site. So private channels should, in my opinion, be used very sparingly. Private channels are only relevant as well if you're using Teams. Maybe you're not using Teams, maybe you only have a SharePoint site with or without a group, in which case creating private channels isn't an option because you don't actually have the you don't have the principle of channels in there. Question from Marinelle. Do you know if there is a way to convert a public channel to a private one after creation and vice versa? There's not. There is simply no option to do that. So a channel, once it's created as public or private, there's no way to convert it. It would be a case of having to recreate it, move the content over, and then delete the old one. There's no option to convert, because what it's doing behind the scenes is so vastly different. Creating a regular public channel within a team simply creates a folder in the documents library named according to that channel, whereas a private channel creates a whole site with unique permissions. So because there's such a vastly different process that's happening behind the scenes, you cannot simply convert one to the other. They'd have to be recreated. All right. Any other questions relating to any of that? No? All right. So it's a good job I allowed an hour plus Q&A time, isn't it? Because we've not even got to the demos yet, and it's nearly an hour's gone. So let's just go through the last couple of slides. So when it comes to training, you know, and I'm certainly not saying this from a sales perspective. The reason that I run a training company is not is because I believe in the importance of training. So I don't believe in the importance of training because I own this company. So it's the reason I'm in training is because there's such it provides such a benefit, and it's such an integral part of ensuring efficiency within organizations. So whether you come to 3 Grow For You training, whether you do it internally, whether you go to another organization, is of course entirely up to you. As an Office 365 evangelist, I just like to see things used properly and things used well. I like organizations to see the benefits of those things. So wherever you get your training from is entirely up to you, but just make sure you do it. Make sure you do engage users in some kind of training. So we can't expect high levels of adoption if people don't know what they're doing. It's important to make training relevant. Training is never a cost. It's always an investment, as long as it's relevant and it's of a good quality. Not every form of training, not every user will require the same means of training. Some people might need comprehensive classroom training. Some people might need some more detailed one-to-one coaching and some special attention. Some people, you could do some kind of short remote courses. Some people, for the more basic end users, you can provide them with general, training video content that they can access on demand wherever is relevant. On the subject of video training, if you're not already familiar with Training Plus, which is a series of video content for all the Office 365 tools, so SharePoint, Teams, Power Apps, Power Automate, Power BI, and so on. If you're not familiar with our Training Plus tool, then feel free to have a look at that. I'll just put a link in the chat to a blog post that gives a bit more information. So you can actually provide, what do I think about the quality of Microsoft's online video training for SharePoint? Very basic. It's more how-to as opposed to the whys and wherefores. There's not a huge amount of content either. So for example, I think in the Microsoft videos, there's I think maybe 30 or 40 hours of SharePoint content or something like that. Whereas, and that's why we have this tool available, is because the Microsoft training videos are not amazing. So with the Training Plus tool, there's something like, I think there's hundreds of hours just for SharePoint, let alone Power Apps, Power Automate, and that kind of thing. And if it's something that you're interested in, the most expensive option is $5 per user per month. And what we mean by the most expensive option, that's the smallest number of users. So that's the 50 and below bracket. And that's for the whole Office 365 suite of content. So including Planner, OneDrive, SharePoint, Teams, Groups, Power Apps, Power Automate, Power BI, Stream, and so on. $5 per user per month. With larger organizations, it can be down to literally cents per month per person to access all that content. So maybe worth having a look into that. If you want any more information on that, there is a blog post I've just sent a link to in the chat, so feel free to have a look at that. If you have any questions, you're welcome to get in touch directly, or if you want to see a live demo of the content, then I'd be happy to schedule that. All right, so finally, last couple of slides before we go into a couple of demos. Understanding that a rollout, so following up, understanding that a rollout is never really finished, especially with constantly evolving cloud tools. So it's not a case of just rolling it out, providing some training, and then leaving people to their own devices. It's a case of going back, ensuring that that engagement has happened, ensuring adoption is taking place. And ensuring that people are aware of changes that are being made to the people are aware of the changes that are being made to these cloud tools. Now, this is something that you should be relying on your IT admin for as well. Your IT admins receive emails to tell them any changes that have happened within Office 365. Not have happened, but will happen. And IT should be keeping an eye on that as the tenant administrators, and should be ensuring that change management takes place. Make sure that people are aware that this is about to change, this is about to change, and so on. So, but by doing that, of course they're ensuring that people aren't, don't have a surprise sprung on them when so there's a significant change to the interface. Quick question on Training Plus and is Training Plus available for personal use? So it's available for use by a single person, but it does have to be associated with a Microsoft 365 tenant. So what you would do is you'd subscribe to the tool for whatever number of people you want to allow access to that tool, and then and then you simply grant access to that content to those internal people. Now, the partner company of ours that provide the tool, they have a monitoring system behind the scenes that allows us to see how many people on each tenant are actually using the content. If you, for example, have subscribed for 5 people, and then we find there's 10 people regularly using that, we might approach you and say, it seems like more people are using this than you've actually paid the licenses for. Would you like to increase your license, or would you like to reduce the number of people using it from your end? So it can be made available to any number of people, but it does have to be associated with your Microsoft 365 tenant. Is there a minimum cost? The minimum cost is for a single person, assuming you want all of the Office 365 content, the minimum cost is $5.50 per person per month. Therefore, $65 for the year for a single person for all the Office 365 content. This content can be accessed directly via an app, which is embedded in Office 365. We can also present videos on SharePoint pages using the embed web part, and you can also, using direct links, you can add those as tabs within Microsoft Teams as well. So you can present the video content to people in a variety of different ways. Could we just get it for 2 months? I'll need to check. I believe that it is, I think it's a minimum 12 months. So a lot of questions firing in here. So I don't believe you can get it. I think it is a 12-month minimum. Do we need ICT to agree to using this? They will need to add the app if you want to access it via the app itself. Otherwise, they don't need to do anything. You can just add those to SharePoint pages during the so you can add, so I'm just keeping an eye on comments as they come in. So yeah, you can, I lost my train of thought. Yeah, you can add those videos to SharePoint pages and links without IT having to do anything. But if you want people to access it via the dedicated app in Office 365, IT will have to add that app. Could you transfer it to someone during the 12 months, perhaps? I'll tell you what, contact me directly, just send me an email and we'll talk about this offline, because this is quite specific now, and I don't want to be taking up other people's time with that. So I just dropped my email address in there. Feel free to get in touch directly and we'll talk about that separately. What I would like to do, because we are already over the hour, is to just go through a couple of demos. So what I'll do is just talk a little bit about the way that Teams and SharePoint kind of interact and a few tips. So I'll just share my whole screen for a moment. And I'm just going to open up a SharePoint site. So I've created a site here for the training team. And within the training team, I have already added a Teams instance to this group connected site as well. And here in the documents library, to which the link, I seem to have accidentally removed that when I was playing around the other day, never mind. So within the documents library, we'll see we've got these folders here which correlate with the channels within the team in Teams. So if we have a series of files, the problem with Teams, if I just jump into the team itself, the problem with Teams is that it's only really designed for small scale collaboration. So this is an example of probably where I wouldn't use it, which is to store information and collaborate as a huge department of potentially dozens of people. Because by creating channels, all that's doing is essentially creating folders in the documents library. Anything I add to the Files tab within the appropriate channel, let's go to WA, for example. We'll see that there's a couple of files. Let's choose one that's empty at the moment. So Queensland, for example, there's nothing in here. And all I'm going to do is create a new file. It's a Word document and just call it Queensland sales test doc. I won't bother adding any content as long as you have the file there. So I've created a file via the Files tab of the Queensland channel of the sales team. Now that directly correlates with the Queensland folder in the documents library of the sales site. So if I open that folder, we'll see that same file. Now for small scale collaboration, that's fine, because all we need is just a handful of documents, maybe managed through a handful of folders that are represented by those channels. If we need something a bit more comprehensive, then this is no good. The way that Teams structures it is no good, because folders are, in general, especially when it comes to larger scale document management scenarios, folders are a terrible way of categorizing stuff. Why are folders such a terrible way of categorizing stuff? What's the downside to folders? Waiting for a couple of answers to come in. And the answers are coming from two people that have been on my, or a few people that have been on my SharePoint training courses, where I push this point quite a lot. There's no metadata. It's completely rigid. The folder structure provides one scenario only. So there's no flexibility to the way we can view the information. What if I wanted to see this information or these files grouped by whoever last modified them? Well, the folders don't give me that. The folders allow me to see it by state or territory only. So the beauty of SharePoint, this is why SharePoint is so popular, is that we can present the information in a lot of different ways. I've got a view that I've created grouped by author, which allows me to group them by whoever last modified those files. I've got a view that groups by state. So that's actually mimicking the grouping of the folders are applying, but in these expand and collapsible groups within which I could potentially have a second layer of grouping if I needed to. I can filter to show only files that I last modified. So it's dynamically filtering based on whoever's looking at the screen, matching that up with the last modified by field. I can filter to show only files where their review date is within the next X amount of time or whatever. So I have that flexibility through SharePoint that I simply don't get by default in Teams. Yes, we can switch the view in Teams, but if I, for example, go into the Victoria channel, into the Files tab, all I'm looking at there is the contents of the Victoria folder of the documents library. And if I then apply grouped by author, it's only grouping those files by author. only the contents of that Vic folder. So I don't have that wider kind of look, if you like. So what we can do is on the general channel, for example, what I could do is choose to add a new tab for a document library. And I could point to the whole document library on that general channel, for example. So here I can choose the site, choose the library, just call it documents. And let's look at the end result. That's horrible. We don't get that full SharePoint experience. This is what the Files tab used to look like. The Files tab used to look like this with, we didn't have the full toolbar and the views and the metadata. We never used to have any of that on Files. We do now, which is quite good. But when we add a document library tab, all we get is a cut down basic version of that library. That's even worse than what we had on the Files tab. So my recommendation, and there's a video here on the 3 Grow YouTube channel that takes you through this as well, is rather than adding a document library tab, what we should be doing is choose the appropriate view. Let's say I want to create a view called, or let's use the grouped by state view. So we're seeing them in groups, not in folders. Copy the URL, and instead, when we add a tab, we don't add a document library tab. We add a website tab. We can do this with any list, any library. Notice the other one is called document singular because it was document library. I just removed the word library. It's documents plural. So this is a link to that view of that library. And by doing this, by adding a website tab, we get the full SharePoint library experience. This could be for a list or a library. It could be pages from your SharePoint site. It could be external web pages, whatever you like. And what this allows us a more flexible approach. So we know that this tab will by default group by state, but I can still switch the view all through Teams. This is what we're talking about earlier when we mentioned about having that, not going for that Teams focused approach. With a Teams focused approach, all we get is folders representing channels, which is fine for small scale collaboration. But as soon as you've got a larger scale requirement, having just a handful of folders is going to be horrible. That's the only way we can manage it. So I just saw a comment pop up, just checking if it was a question or a comment. So just a comment from Jess. So it's much more effective to actually bring that in, because we then get the other what this allows us to do, that we talked about providing familiarity. So what we want to do is ensure that the users are able to access those files in as similar a way as possible to how they did within their, let's say, their network drive that they're moving away from. So what we want is the users to be able to go to, in the same way as they would go to the sales folder in the network drive, to the customer documents folder, to the Acme Industries folder. We want them to be able to follow that same process initially. So I want them to follow the same steps, the same words: sales, customer documents, then whatever customer they want to see the documents for. So we can't really achieve that through these channels. What we'll do instead, here I've got a library for customer documents, and here I've got some files I've just thrown in there. Not all of them have their metadata, but I've one thing that we don't get on that horrible tab in here is things like your content types and metadata. What we don't get with the documents library that is therefore pulled into the files tab, we don't get content types pulled into there by default, and so on. So it's better to structure your documents through SharePoint, then using SharePoint functionality, then bring it into Teams to make it visible to people there. So here I'm able to set the properties of the document. like so. Because it's a quote, it's requesting customer, account manager, and date raised. If it was an invoice, it would also have a mandatory purchase order number column as well. What I can then do is create a view that groups by customer, because that's how the users would normally see them in their network drive, is a folder per customer. So now I've got the metadata. If you're not too familiar with content types, I would massively recommend looking into those. Probably the most important aspect of SharePoint when it comes to your information architecture. So now I've created a new group called, a new view called group by customer. I'm then going to do exactly that. I'm going to group it by customer. I'm going to then hide this column, which is no longer adding any value, because of course it's grouping by that anyway. Make sure the view is saved. What I'm then going to do is copy the URL back into Teams. If I just add a channel here, let's just delete this one because that's not adding anything of any value. If I just add a new tab to the general channel, if I were to add a document library web part from sales, customer documents, the end result is going to be pretty nasty. No metadata, no views, just all we really see is file name, who last modified it, and so on. Not good. So let's add another tab, this time a website tab, as I did before. Customer docs, paste the URL. And what we now get is the full document library experience. We get our content types, we get the full toolbar, we get the full menu against each of those documents, we get the views, and so on. And what we're doing is providing a presentation of the files that is very similar to what the user was already familiar with in their network drive. But rather than going folder, 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 they're going to the team, the channel, the tab, and then the appropriate group. Or in SharePoint, same process. They go to the site, to the library, and then the appropriate group. So we're presenting the information. What I would do is I'd set this as the default view. So the default view should be should mimic whatever folder structure the users were familiar with in their network drive. So there's that instant familiarity. So the words that they're following are the same. They're still going sales, customer documents, then the customer group. But instead of folder, 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 it's site, library, group. But the words they're following are the same. So there's an instant familiarity, but the benefit of having additional views to present information in different ways by sorting and filtering and grouping and so on. So there's familiarity and then additional benefits on top of that. So if you want good adoption of Teams, then we need to be focused, we need to have more of a SharePoint focus first, because if all people ever see is just documents restricted by essentially folders, because that's what's happening behind the scenes, remember, if you want them to have more flexible means of accessing those files, then we need to push that from a SharePoint perspective and structure it there, then add tabs to present the information in different ways there. While we're here, this is just an example of adding of one of those Training Plus videos that I've added to a channel in here. So we can add those Training Plus videos into your channels. You can also add these web parts in a SharePoint site as well, so you can collate training videos together in SharePoint as well to provide training content to the users. So full audio, visual demos, explanations, and so on. I won't go into too much more detail. All right. So, question from Marinelle. Do you manage permissions then from SharePoint directly? For example, if you create the Teams as a public one for the entire company, then restrict access to the library via SharePoint. I wouldn't create. Personally, I don't like the idea of an organization-wide team. I think the whole principle of Teams is it's team-based collaboration. It goes back to that same point earlier. I wouldn't have a group connected team site for any more than 12 to 15 people because it just gets messy. So I personally wouldn't have an organization-wide team. If I create a public group and therefore there's a team associated with that group, that would be more for the reason it's public is not because everyone's in it. It's more public because it allows anyone to join it if they wish, which is generally used not for more project-based or department-based work. That's more about, for example, here's a team where we can discuss upcoming social events. If people want to join it, then they can. So. You say, would you then restrict access to the library via SharePoint? I would avoid changing permissions at the a library level, a folder level, a document or list item level. I would avoid that wherever possible. Sometimes it has to be done, but I certainly wouldn't use that as a standard approach. A site should contain information on a particular subject or topic, and the people that have access to it are the ones that need access to that content. There may be the odd anomaly where we need to restrict permissions or something like that, but I don't think it should be too common. If it's for if you need somewhere for the whole organization to communicate, maybe thinking about creating Yammer networks for that kind of stuff. Or if you simply want to push information out to the organization, that's what a communication site is for. So a SharePoint intranet site. So as it's all about choosing the right tool for the right job.
Ross, but let's say that with the example that you're mentioning of the social teams, right? If you have these social teams and you have your SharePoint in the background and you are sharing this information with everyone, but let's say that you have a folder or a library where you have the budget for the social events, and you want only for 3 or 4 people out of your team to be able to see that budget. So for the rest, you want to share everything, okay? So do you recommend to then, let's say in my Teams, I have several tabs for, like the information about next social events. But I have another tab for that budget, which is going to be restricted just to 4 people. So do you recommend to manage those access through SharePoint directly?
Yeah, you can't manage permissions through Teams other than creating a private channel. So private channels, I said, I don't generally like the idea of them because it creates a whole new site. For a small anomaly like that, what I would suggest in that instance is, let's say here within the documents library of this SharePoint site, if I had a group of people that needed permission to some files in here, what I would do is just create a folder called budget files or something like that. I would then lock down the permissions on that only to certain people. I wouldn't necessarily need a channel for it. I could have a channel. I could have a folder that's not a channel. It's just a folder in a library. And what I could then do is just manage access, and I could then simply remove the permissions of anybody that doesn't need access to that, like so. So maybe just leave the site owners as the only people with any permissions, just for the sake of the example. So now I've restricted the permissions of that folder. I can then add whatever I like in here. Let's just create an Excel file called budget. So I wouldn't create a new library for it because I still want I want people from who do have access to this file to see it alongside all the other social documents. Does that make sense? So, for example, I want people to be able to go in here and see all the files. And you'll see here, I've got access to budget. If I wasn't a site owner, I would see everything else, but not this one. Because this view, I've got the default all documents view, which shows the folders. I've created another view, which strips the folders away and shows the contents of all those folders in just one flat list. So even though the folders aren't visually showing, the documents are still adhering to the permissions that they're inheriting from the folder. So all I did there was in the settings of that view, so edit the view. I will have shown you this on the SharePoint training course that you went on as well. But just as a reminder, and for those who've not seen this before, here in the view, we can ask it to show all items without their folders. So it's stripping away the folder structure. That's especially important when it comes to creating grouped views. Because if I were to take the folders view, and if I were to say group it by author, so group it by modified by, I'm seeing folders grouped by author. Then inside a folder, I see those files grouped by the author. I'm not seeing everything in one go. It kind of defeats the purpose of having this flexible approach. So certainly when applying grouping, it's important to strip away that folder structure. You'll notice here, grouped by author, we don't see any folders.
If you create, let's say, a piece of metadata to tag the documents related only to budget activities, right, to budgeting,
yep.
And then you create a view group by those that are equals to budget, and you paste that on your teams, and I don't have permissions because I'm a member. So you are an owner, okay? What am I going to see? I'm not going to see even the tab in Teams, or it's going to be something like access denied, or
you'll still see the tab, but and that's why we do it this way, because we don't decide who sees the tabs. We decide who sees the documents, and then, for example, if I were to take just this flat view here, I see this file, which means when if I were to add this to the tab in Teams, I will see it. So here, back into sales, into the general channel, for example,
because you have
add
permissions.
tab there. In fact, we've already got a tab that shows the documents. If I were to change the view, I will see budget, just like when I change to the view that groups by state. There's an unassigned group and budget is in there. But if I didn't have permission to the budget folder, I therefore don't have permission to the budget document, and therefore I simply don't see it here. So you don't need to worry about adding a separate tab just for those, because as someone who has access to all the files, I want to see all the files in one place. I don't want to have to go to one place for the files that everyone's allowed to see, then go somewhere else to find the stuff that only me and someone else is allowed to see. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yes.
I want to see them all in one place, but still controlled through permissions, which is where folders come in really handy. But again, just bear in mind that should be used quite sparingly, because as soon as you do that, you've broken permission inheritance. So certain changes you make to the site permissions may not affect that library. So just be aware of that.
Thank you.
All right. So there we go. There's some tips on how to best approach Teams in order to ensure that we still get the benefits of SharePoint while maintaining relevance and familiarity to the users, and also taking the benefits of Teams, which is the ability to pull things together into one place, but without that Teams focused approach, which simply provides us with folders only, which aren't necessarily an efficient way of categorizing and accessing those files. All right, so before we therefore wrap up, does anybody, oh, there's only two of you left actually, I think. Oh no, sorry, I was looking at the bottom there, I thought there's only two people left. There's a whole load of you up here as well. Let's go mad for a moment. So does anyone else have any final questions, queries or comments relating to anything that we've talked about within the session? No? All right. If you do think of any questions, or if you'd like any advice or anything, then of course you're more than welcome to get in touch directly. I will just paste my email address into the group chat again, so you've got that easily available. So yeah, any questions at all, any help, advice you need, then please feel free to get in touch. I hope you found the session useful. I will be adding the recording to the 3Grow YouTube channel, so keep your eye out for that. I'll be posting a blog post on the 3Grow website that will contain a link to the video. I'll also be posting it on the social platforms as well, so LinkedIn and Twitter and Facebook and so on. The video will be available through links there as well. So thank you very much again for attending, and enjoy the rest of your day and have a great weekend. Take care. Bye.